Great to see you all. I'm very excited to welcome back Dr. Kira Mauseth and Dr. Tona McGuire. They joined us a little over a month ago for an excellent session. The feedback that we got in the post-event survey and in follow-up conversations with all of you was, wow, amazing, bring them back, I want more. So we listened, and I'm so thankful that they're giving us their time today. So Kira, Tona, welcome.
Thank you. I'm blushing. Thanks, Sarah. So I think we'll do introductions first. And so I'll introduce myself and ask Kira to introduce herself, and then we'll kind of move ahead and move right on into what we want to talk about today. So I'm Tona McGuire. I'm a pediatric psychologist, meaning I've spent most of my career working with kids and families dealing with chronic and acute illnesses and traumatic injuries. I'm also involved in disaster preparation and response for about 17 years now, which makes me feel even older than I actually am, which is pretty old. Both here in Washington and also internationally. And Kira and I have gotten into a lot of trouble together. So Kira?
That's one, excuse me, that's one way of putting it, yes. My name is Kira Mauseth. Hi, everyone. I'm going to try and mute myself if I need to cough. I'm recovering from some sinus stuff. I'm a clinical psychologist. I work with teenagers and adults. In one of my hats, I do a lot of consulting with educators and businesses and large and small around the state. I am a full-time associate teaching professor at Seattle U. And like with Tona, we do this HST health support team work, which really is around enhancing local and regional capacity to respond to all different sizes of disasters and critical incidents. So recognizing how many things we've been through and what is, just kind of keeps coming up in terms of both natural disasters and other potential challenges for kids and the education system and the teachers and all the adults who are supporting them. That's why we really are invested in doing this kind of work and sharing this information with you as much as we can. So thank you for being here today.
Indeed. Next slide, please. So, or the back one or the forward one. So all of us have been through, I don't even know how to put it to words, the ringer over the last 3 years. For a variety of reasons, number one being the incredible pandemic and the impact of what we did around the pandemic on all of us. And your organizations wisely have decided to begin the conversation about what that has been for us and what that has been for you and what have we learned from it and how can we move forward. And so the point of the webinar today is to kind of lay that foundation, to talk about what the science is behind recovering from an event like this. For some of us, it's been multiple events, maybe even on top of, pre-existing trauma, how to talk with each other, because those conversations sometimes are difficult and challenging and put all of us on edge. And then what else can we do to kind of move through the rest of the recovery from this the last 3 years, really. Next slide, please. So we want to be able to figure out how we feel about what has happened to us. We want to be able to describe that. If you're doing trauma therapy with kids, we talk about developing a trauma narrative. What is it that happened to me? How did it start? How was I feeling about it? Where were my thoughts going? How did those things all get connected in? Because part of calming and getting comfortable with what has happened is developing that story and just exposing ourselves to the things that we went through rather than avoiding them. So we want to be able to process this trauma, and I think it really was trauma. I don't think we can minimize what we've all lived through over the last 3 years. And then kind of what can we do better, differently? What can we do right now? What do we need to do over the next couple of years? Next slide, please. I will be glad when I never have to see this slide again. Those of you who have been to any of our DOH presentations or other presentations, this is a slide that we have shown 1,000 times. And the reason that we do it is because it provides some truth and context to what happens to people. Everybody, doesn't matter what culture you're in, where you are in the world, what language you speak. This is what happens to us when we have a disaster. So we have that impact phase, which for us in Washington was March of 2020 when the governor shut the state down, and it was like, holy cow. And then we have the honeymoon heroic phase. We're all kind of coming together. In COVID, it was a lot of memes and, videos, YouTubes, TikToks about, how we're going to get all through this. And then we go into that disillusionment phase because we get tired and it's not gone and we're still dealing with it. And in the impact from the pandemic, we had not just the first time, earthquake recovery, but we had the second impact, the different variants coming through. And on top of that, other kind of disasters in Washington state, big floods in the north part of Washington last winter, wildfires in the summer. So lots of things layered on top of them. And when we go through each event, we go through that same emotional response. We're kind of shocked, and then we try to pull ourselves together, and then we get tired. And in disasters, in that disillusionment phase, that's when we see a lot of increases in suicide, depression, and anxiety. And all of that is normal. But it doesn't mean we can't do something about it. So if you think right now about the horrible earthquake in Turkey and Syria, they're at that impact stage right now. They just are in kind of stunned, frantic, trying to, get people out from under buildings. Pretty soon, we'll probably see them begin to do that social cohesiveness that happens in the heroic honeymoon phase. The media is there. The Syrians and the Israelis, who are technically still at war, are helping each other through this. There's the political issues tend to go away. People just come together to respond. But just like we saw when we were in Poland last spring with the Ukrainian war, that will disappear and people will come down into that, I'm really tired, this isn't done yet, I don't have my house yet. So this kind of sets the stage for what we've been through so that you can kind of put it within a framework of what happens to everybody when they go through a serious event like this. Next slide, please. So we want to understand that what happens to us is a neurological event. Like there's nothing wrong with us because we are having trouble sleeping or our stomachs hurt or we're irritated at everybody. Everybody kind of responds to critical events like disasters and school shootings and other things with a brain response. Next slide, please. And one more. I want to talk a little bit about this. So again, this is some of the stuff that we covered in our previous talk with you guys last time, but we think about the brain. It really helps us to understand why we're feeling the way that we're feeling and why we're acting the way that we're acting. I look around the world sometimes and I feel like everybody has lost their mind, including me on occasion, just so reactive, so irritable, so aggressive. And it's because for several years now, our brain has been on fight or flight, threat response. We're having to adapt all the time. And we don't even have the gift of mitigating that, at least early in the pandemic, by our social support and our social connections. So we went through this very traumatic event, and without the kind of social support that might have allowed us to come through a little more comfortably, a little less on edge. So when we start to have conversations about what happened to us, we want to think about the fact that we have to readjust that neurology. We have to be careful about how we begin to process and talk about what we've all been through, this trauma that we have all been through, so that we can do it in a healthy and productive way instead of just yelling at each other. Next slide, please. think this is you, Kira.
So one of the things that we get asked about fairly frequently when we do talks like this is this relationship between stress and trauma. And I think Tona said it perfectly a second ago. We don't want to minimize anything that happened. Everyone has gone through incredibly, at least moderate to severe levels of stress over the last several years. And I mean, everyone, young kids all the way up. Not necessarily everyone's been traumatized, but I think the majority of people have experienced some kind of trauma over the course of the pandemic based on, resource issues, relationship issues, financial, all kinds of things that can cause this. There is not a particular formula that says now it's trauma and now it's stress. But what we do know is that in terms of how it plays out physiologically and in the brain, that all trauma is stressful, but not all stress is traumatic. The same kinds of systems are activated under both circumstances. The fight or flight system, the limbic system, which is that emotional center, which causes Tona was listing all of those things, the aggressiveness, the irritability. The one that I wanted to add to the list was impulsivity. We're so quick to react to other people. And this challenge of getting the entire brain to be part of the response to another person, especially a person with whom we disagree, or we might have a conflict, is a really, really big challenge because of this. Right? Because of the degree of stress and potentially trauma that many people have experienced. I was mentioning, we were both talking about sort of this adrenaline fight or flight response a second ago. And really there are two. The HPA system is more often associated with stress, and the SAM system is more often associated with adrenaline or fight or flight. But they do work together in a similar kind of a way. So the HPA system is the system that produces cortisol, which is our stress hormone. And I jokingly call cortisol the Goldilocks hormone because it has to be just right. You can't have too little, you can't have too much. Cortisol, if you think of it like a bell curve, you need the middle zone. If you have too little cortisol, it actually compromises your immune system and makes you susceptible because cortisol is protective until it goes over the top of the bell curve and it's on the other side. And then having too much can actually make you sick itself. So there's this fine little window in the middle. And I would argue, and I'm assuming Tona would agree with me here, that most adults are walking around with more than their share of cortisol right now. We have elevated levels, and that affects our cognitive functioning. That affects our impulse control, our reasoning. It affects our ability to sleep. Stomach aches and headaches, lots of physiological symptoms that go with increases in cortisol. And you see this with kids too. Kids are not immune to this part of the process. And then the SAM system is the sort of the pairing, and that's the fast fight or flight. That's the sympathoadrenomedullary system. And that is adrenaline that gets released when we feel threatened. So in thinking about the neurophysiology, there's two things. Number one is that we want to get to a place when we have these conversations where the prefrontal cortex, which is the logical, consequence-oriented, thoughtful part of the brain, is working in harmony with the limbic system, which is the emotional responding, the protective, defensive, impulsive, fight or flight, like that safety center, that defensive place. We want both the limbic system and the prefrontal cortex to be working together to engage in thoughtful and productive conversations. If it's just the limbic system that's leading the charge on the communication and the interaction, I can pretty much write the script for how that's going to go, which is to say not well. That's going to be high intensity. It's going to be emotional. It's not going to end in a logical sort of resource-oriented problem-solving conclusion. You want your prefrontal cortex to be able to talk to your limbic system, these pieces working back and forth. And that's for adults, right? Keep in mind, please, that the prefrontal cortex, that logical center, is not fully developed in human beings until you're in your early 20s. And so kids, as we've known, right, they struggle with this sort of consequence-oriented decision-making throughout the middle school and teenage years anyway. But when we're asking them to sit down and make good decisions about their future and talk through some of their experiences that they've had over the last couple of years, we really have to keep in mind that as hard as it is for us to balance the logic and the emotion with all the brain stuff that we've got going on, it's harder for them. because they're coming from a place where their physiology makes it even more challenging than it does for us, which is, I think, saying something, because I think most of us are challenged in this way. We've mentioned, both of us, a couple of these common experiences and challenges and symptoms. There's always a few that I like to reference that I think we did also bring up in December, but the cognitive symptoms of being confused, being distracted, feeling like you can't concentrate on anything. It feels like symptoms of kind of ADHD quality, or being concerned about early onset dementia. Those are very, very normal when your cortisol levels are so high. Tona and I had an email exchange just yesterday. I'll just go ahead and say this to everyone. She was like, what are we going to do for the HST thing in Idaho, or whatever it was? And I was like, Idaho? I didn't know we were, like, I completely forgot about Idaho. What's in Idaho? And she was like, oh, just kidding. It's Utah. I'm like, oh my gosh. I thought that my brain had a black hole and had completely forgotten about an Idaho project, which would have been honestly fairly normal, if I'm being frank with you all. So that kind of thing happens. And if, did I send that email? What was I getting at the grocery store? Like, that sort of lack of cohesion around our thought process follows out into all of these activities that we do. So when you're at work, you're trying to talk to some students, you're trying to support them and help them through some of the discussion around what's going on with them. Your brain might be having trouble staying focused, tuning in, being oriented, in a way that you're not distracted all the time. That's what happens when we have a lot of stress hormone affecting our functioning. It's also fairly likely, I don't need to go through the whole list here, but it's also fairly likely that you've had some trouble with sleep. Most people have had a lot of sleep disruption over the last couple of years, and we're engaging in this fun new phenomenon that the American Sleep Association is calling revenge bedtime procrastination. And that's when you stay up until 2 o'clock in the morning looking at your phone. I'm picking 2 o'clock randomly, but any hour, right? TikTok and Instagram and Twitter and you name it, because you just can, for no reason, really. So we need to do a little bit better at self-regulation, which is hard when our limbic system is in control, because the limbic system just wants to do what it wants to do, including stay up until some unreasonable hour. And so, sleep hygiene for kids and sleep hygiene for adults is fundamental to being able to set the stage for a productive, logical, problem-solving conversation. If you're not getting enough rest, it shifts the odds against you for being able to have a productive conversation the next day. Let alone to, take care of regular day-to-day tasks, or for kids to learn new material, right? Let's not even think about the math curriculum. That's hard enough as it is. So lots of things going on. Also, substance use increases. Some interesting data just came out just in the last week or two, I think. I don't know, Tona, if you saw this same study about substance use having gone down in 2020 for teenagers. And I thought, well, sure, because they're not in school. They couldn't access it in the same way. But sure enough, it's climbed back up again. And then for adults, what happens is that it kind of went high and stayed high, which is what we tend to see after disasters, large scale of this type. Yeah, Tona, do you want to add anything about any of the other symptoms? There's a range, and they're common. I think we want to get across the normalization of these experiences.
And they don't go in a row. It's like the Kubler-Ross's stages of grief. You go into one, out of the other, moving back and forth. They get better, they get worse. So it's not like okay, I'm through the spiritual part and now I'm done. So keep in mind.
You can also go through the same stage in one day, like 5 times. So you can have emotion regulation in the morning and then be completely dysregulated in the afternoon on the same day. That's normal too. So
especially if your colleague misspells the state name for the presentation you're doing.
And then I just had a panic attack and it was fine. The only other thing that we wanted to add a separate graph, because it really applies to a lot of what people might be seeing in schools in K-12 all the way up, is this behavioral phenomenon that we call acting out versus acting in. And all this really is this is actually informed somewhat by personality types and characteristics, but all of us we tend to express our distress either in an external way or an internal way. we just tend to be drawn towards one of those two poles. So rather than being one bell curve, we tend to be drawn, again, based on personality characteristics, towards expressing our distress externally. And that could be hostility, anger, aggression, maybe doing something illegal or reckless, right? Or we tend to express our distress internally by shutting down and withdrawing and isolating and not participating. So in the classroom, this looks like a kid who was doing okay and is now flipping over desks or starting a fight or, you know, pushing other kids, right? Acting out in that way. Or a kid who was engaged and is now sitting with their head down and not participating and not raising their hand in class. So that acting out, acting in is a normal response pattern that humans tend to have. It doesn't last forever. But if it is something that you're seeing, it's good to be aware of. There might be something additional going on at home or a set of stressors that's sort of prolonging that acting out and acting in pattern. I think this is you, Tona.
All right. So we want to start with talking about how to talk. And when we first began to think about this process, sort of this informational webinar, and then, you know, some potential listening sessions around that, we wanted to give you some information about safe and effective ways of having challenging conversations sometimes. And one of the things that we want to kind of warn people about a little bit is the debrief. People use that term widely for a whole variety of different things. And it's a charged term in our profession because of the research that's gone into the whole, you know, you've been through a difficult event and now you need to debrief. So I want to just talk a little bit about some of the red flags around debriefing in general, which is not actually what we're going to be about. So next slide. Oops, there we go. So there are two that have been very popular: CISM, which is critical incident stress management, and CISD, which is critical incident stress debriefing. They came out of the first responder population, and there was a psychologist who was also a firefighter. And he developed a lot of these tools and techniques, and they became widely used and very, very popular until the research literature started to come out with questions and concerns about that kind of a process. You have to come. It's everybody. We're all going to talk about what happened to us, all of the things that we went through. Now, in a very, very specific situation, let's say you're a firefighter and you and your 6 friends were all in the same event and something terribly traumatic happened and you all witnessed it. In that situation, it's possible that a debrief might prove to be beneficial. In the broader scope of that, debriefs have tended to prove themselves to be traumatizing to other people that didn't witness the same things, to increase the trauma for the people that have been through the event. And there's no evidence, no research evidence to date that says your risk of PTSD goes down if you are put into a group and made to talk. So those are kind of all the red flags, kind of the warning flags around any sort of debrief. I work with a lovely young surgeon on one of my committees, and he was, unfortunately, the surgical resident on call at the hospital that was about 2 blocks away from the Pulse nightclub shooting. And so he was by himself at that point. It was in the middle of the night. The attendings had all gone home, and he was the receiving surgeon for all of these young, mostly men, his age, coming in with these terrible gunshot wounds that he was having to triage and manage all by himself, having to tell someone his own age that they weren't likely to survive. You know, so this was a horrific incident that he lived through. And unfortunately, compounding that, the hospital decided to do a debrief. And they mandated that everybody would come to the debrief, all the surgeons, all the nurses, respiratory therapists, housekeeping staff, everybody, people who weren't even at the event to come to the debrief. And that debrief was in and of itself traumatizing for him, because he had to listen to the story again, for one, which is not a bad thing when you're working with trauma, but he had to share with people who were not at all in the same experience. And there was probably a lot of trauma on their end as well. So I think of him, Josh, as my poster child for be careful how you process things that have happened to you. Next slide. Thanks. So when we're getting into these challenging conversations and our brains are not always at optimal levels, one of the things we want to do first, before we do anything else, is figure out where we are kind of in our level of arousal. So if we're in this, I am so angry right now, I'm going to have this conversation with my coworker because he or she did so and so and this and that. If we're angry, if we're in that red zone, we cannot have a functional conversation. We're not going to have anything productive come out of that. The same if they're in that situation where they're also so aroused, so angry, just activated all over, they can't listen effectively. They can't respond effectively, because when we're in that state, what we want to do is punch somebody or leave. So you want to take stock of where you are. What's your temperature reading in terms of your capacity really to have an engaged and fruitful conversation. And this doesn't mean that you don't have feelings about what you're talking about, or that you have to be a robot about them, but you want to be somewhere in the middle of this threat thermometer, if you will, where your prefrontal cortex is engaged and your limbic system is calmed down a little bit. The other extreme is if you're all the way off the chart, you are so tired, you lack such capacity to have any energy for this conversation. It's just a whatever kind of moment. If you're in that position, or the person you're trying to speak with is in that position, again, neither of you have the energy to engage in any sort of productive way. This happens with kids too. And one of the things that we know about both kids and adults is that if you're at either extreme, either red or blue, physical activity can kind of reactivate the parts of the brain that you want reactivated and put you a little more in the middle, where conversations might begin to be more effective, more helpful. So where are you and where are they in terms of what you perceive their capacity to actually have this conversation in any sort of way that isn't going to be destructive and not good for either of you? Next slide, please. So you want to think about conversations, as particularly difficult conversations, as a challenge and not a threat. We know that how we think about things affects how we feel about things. That's kind of one of the core foundational aspects of cognitive behavioral therapy. It's identifying thoughts that are not helpful, recognizing thoughts that are connected with feelings that we have, just sort of being aware of those things. So reframing it in your head and using that challenge vocabulary as opposed to threat can, again, sort of calm your limbic system down, get your prefrontal cortex ready to start to have those conversations. The other thing that sometimes we're just not aware of is what is the message we're giving out without saying a single word. So are we looking, incredibly tight and, not open? I don't want to really hear what you have to say. I've got my own opinions about things. Is the tone of our voice in our culture too loud? Our eye contact, are we looking at someone in that conversation? Are we not looking at them? And these things are culturally determined as well. So in some cultures, eye contact is very disrespectful. That's not something that you do. So being aware of what our bodies are telling us. When we're talking with someone, one of the things that we know is we have these wonderful things called mirror neurons, monkey see, monkey do. And you can use those to calm yourself down and to calm the other person down. So if you're taking a breath and you slow down the pace of your words a little bit, they can almost not stop themselves from copying you. Taking a breath, they slow down a little bit too. So paying attention to what your body is saying, the message that you're giving in terms of your tone and the volume of your words, your eye contact, how close you are standing to someone. Again, all culturally mediated. So I think Kira and I shared this last time we talked to you, but when we were in Haiti, I felt like everybody was loud and angry and intrusive because the social distance was much closer and the verbal expression was much more lively. So for a Olympic medal introvert like myself, I would find myself sort of backing away and backing away until I got used to it. Oh, they're not mad. That's just how they talk here. So again, sort of focusing on the situation around you, the context around you, what you're giving out and what they're giving out. So once you've taken your temperature, their temperature, you're getting to the place where you feel like, okay, I might be able to have this conversation. We want to really encourage you to practice what are called active listening skills. Now, I would pretty much guarantee that most of you have been taught this at some point in your lives, in your careers, in Psych 101, if nothing else. But it is a small intervention that has massively large impact, even though it doesn't feel like you're doing anything. And we hear that a lot when we're doing our health support team training, the disaster behavioral health curriculum training. We train a lot on active listening and communication. And the most common response is, I feel like I'm not helping them. I don't feel like I'm doing anything. So the points in active communication are listening deeply, shutting up, really, not thinking about you, what you're going to say next, but really listening without interrupting. And then using those clarifying questions, reflecting back a little bit on what you think they're hearing, being empathetic. That's the time when you can talk a little bit. Again, active listening, active communication skills really are mostly the listening part, and then a little bit the communicating back part. What you don't want to do, and what we tend to do because we're helpers, is problem solve. You hear what the person's saying, and your first comment is, well, what you really should think about and do is X. Not helpful and not active listening. So you're looking to figure out what the problem is, not solve the problem. You want to deeply understand what they're saying, how they're feeling about it, how they're thinking about it. And then you can begin to elicit more information. Next slide, please. And these are, open-ended questions that you can start with. It's okay to be really broad in the beginning. You might start with an observation. It feels like, to me, things might be a little tense between us, and I'm wondering if we can talk a little bit about that. Then listening to what the person responds with, and then asking those questions again. Can you help me understand a little bit more about this? Or, are you saying that? That's that kind of clarifying question. Again, when you're doing this listening, you want to be able to pay attention to the, yeah, but, if you're having a conversation, you're trying not to problem solve, but what you're getting back from the person is, no, that's not going to work. I don't think this is going to work. Yeah, I hear you. But then again, you want to back off more from the problem solving aspect and really just sort of get back into the empathetic listening part. It's hard in the beginning. It becomes more natural and more intuitive the more that you do it. And it is, again, sort of this powerful intervention for people. Sometimes this is the only thing they need to help them feel better. They don't even need to solve the problem. They just need to think about the people that they have spoken to who really seem to understand what it is. Next slide, please. So with kids, same deal. They're a little trickier. When they're little, they tend to ask questions and bring up things in the weirdest places, not always convenient places. So it's, if you can, when a child or a teenager is wanting to talk to you, that's the time to set things aside. You can't always plan on after dinner, we'll have a conversation, when the dishes are done and we're all, sitting around. Sometimes it's in the car on the way to soccer practice, or it's right before bedtime and it's not actually a stalling technique. So when kids want to talk, that's a good time to think about putting aside what you're doing, really focusing on them. Kids will pick up on the nonverbal messages, those kind of body messages and tone messages, more than anything that we say. And so if somebody is in your ear talking about something that is concerning them or they want to share, that's the time to turn around, to look at them, not be on your phone, not be multitasking, because that kind of focused attention is powerful for kids. Down on the adult section, we talk about I language rather than you language. And when we're doing couples therapy, this is one that we really push hard. There are ways of saying things and there are ways of saying things. So when you use I sort of messages instead of you sort of messages, it tends to diffuse that defensiveness. So I would really appreciate it if you would not leave in the dishes in the sink to soak. Not all dishes need to soak. Now, I would not use air quotes if I'm talking to my husband, because he would find that really disrespectful, but as he should. But it's that sort of, I'm observing this. This is what I am asking. I feel, rather than you always, you never, etc., etc., etc. The other thing we do in marriage therapy is talk about kind of a check-in. So when an adult is talking with you, when your spouse is speaking with you and they're kind of venting, that's a good time to stop and say something like, would you like me just to listen? Do you just need somebody to kind of offload onto? Or would you like any sort of suggestions? Can I help you with this problem? Or do you just need me to kind of dump? Once you get that clear, the conversation with any adult, including spouses and partners, goes much more easily. The couple of the little bullet points around adolescence is when they have gone through something like they have gone through, particularly in the last 3 years, any sort of big event like this, we want to try to help them be future focused, not to think, because kids don't have a lot of forward cognitive capacity, not to think, my life is always going to be like this, or I'm never going to move forward. My high school was so just, I couldn't do all the things I wanted to do in high school. And so why bother? I just feel like, this ruined my whole life. Those kinds of things. If you can help them think about the near short term and then maybe a little bit the longer short term, that sort of positive focus. What are you looking forward to in the next couple of weeks? And then you can get into, where do you see yourself after high school? And if they're able to say things reasonably, calmly, and respectfully, particularly teenagers, that's the time to express appreciation for that. I know it probably was hard for you to tell me these things calmly, but it's really helpful for me. I can better able figure out, what we need to do in this situation if you're not yelling at me and calling me names. So I really appreciate the respectful conversation we just had. Next slide, please. I think it's you, Kira.
Okay. So despite all of our best efforts, there will be a need to de-escalate people who are really upset and angry on, I don't know, I don't want to say a fairly regular basis, but it does come up, I think, fairly often. And so this model that I developed called SAFE is meant to summarize, it's not steps, it's just a summary of best practices that when it comes to keeping in mind to have a good sort of a de-escalation orientation when you're working with a teenager, an adolescent, another adult who's very upset about something. In a lot of different directions. It could be anxiety, it could be anger, right? It's just de-escalation in general. And in terms of incorporating the brain work that we were discussing earlier, and the acknowledgement that how we perceive something really informs how we feel about it. Like the labels that we put on how we're feeling tells us how we're feeling. There was a study that was done at Harvard, actually. This was years ago now, but it was, they took these students and they gave them a math test, which I don't know about you all, but math makes me and Tona, both of us, anxious, I think, on a regular basis. And to the control group, they did nothing. They were just like, we're going to test your anxiety, rate it, and then you take your math tests, and we'll see how you did. And to the experimental group, they said, we want you to tell yourself that you're excited to take the math test. And the proportion, it was 80% of the students improved their score by more than 20%, just because they told themselves that they were excited rather than anxious in their head. And so the labels that we use to sort of interpret how our bodies are feeling about things make a huge difference in the practical real world too, right? So in terms of de-escalation, these are just some of those best practices for monitoring, how you're doing and how you can most effectively communicate with someone else who's upset. So Tona mentioned most of these already when we had the slide on active listening. I think I really want to re-emphasize the point about the mirror neurons. The last thing you want to do when someone is upset, of course, is do the little head pat of take a deep breath and calm down, right? Nobody wants to hear that. That just makes people more mad. It's not the good strategy. And this part, this self piece of de-escalation, this is what I struggle with the most. It's hard for me. When someone's mad at me, I get mad back. I have a hard time regulating my own self. So I know that for me, this is the most challenging piece of de-escalation. But knowing that, right, going into it, recognizing that I need to represent a calmness. I need to bring a certain energy to the space, and I need to engage those mirror neurons so that I can increase the likelihood that the other person is going to feel that calm. And only by doing simple things such as slowing down the rate of my speech, lowering the register of my voice, even if you're working on Zoom, right? Tona mentioned this. If you sort of sit back, take an observable deep breath. I didn't tell anybody to do that, and I can't see all of you, but I'm wondering if people didn't take a deep breath just because I'm walking you through the process, right? With no instruction around it. That same kind of thing. You can do that. It works more effectively in person, right, than it even does on a camera. So being really mindful of that. And then the other thing is that if you're working with a student or a colleague from a background that's different than your own, right, in terms of age or gender or ethnicity, they're unfamiliar to you and their cultural communication practices in some way, right? Because we can vary by all of those little nuances. The best approach in that case is to follow their lead, right? If you're not sure what kind of eye contact is appropriate, then follow their lead, right? Don't stare them down if they're not looking at you. If they're looking at the floor because they might be uncomfortable or whatever, then just sort of copy that practice, because that will help put them at ease as well. So really using their framework as a way to decide how some of those nonverbals might work best. For the A in SAFE, this is about area awareness, and this is about knowing where the exits are, knowing where your resources, any potential weapons that are around. If you're working with someone who's really, if you have an appointment scheduled with a student or with a parent who, has been upset before or might have raised some concerns, ask a colleague, leave the door open and ask a colleague or ajar to walk by and just pop their head in and just check on things, or just have a listening ear to make sure things are okay. Like, try to do some planning. What happens when we are in a situation where someone is very upset and angry is we tend to get tunnel vision, and our bodies do that on purpose because we tend to focus on the threat. And so if your brain is perceiving a person who is angry as a threat, we tunnel vision to put all of our resources in play to protect us or defend us from that person. And what we forget is to pay attention to our surroundings at that point. So we lose track of, where the door is and what the other people are around who might be able to help me or whatever the situation is. So really staying grounded in your whole brain so you don't get that tunnel vision, and so that you're aware of the resources and not placing yourself between an angry person and an exit. That's one of the key things about de-escalation, is that an angry person needs an egress so that they don't have to go through you to get out. So when someone's upset, don't make them push you out of the way. Don't block, subconsciously, just don't be in the way. Have it so that you have access to the door and they do as well. Yeah. Okay. The F in safe is for feelings. And as the clinician, Tona might agree with me on this one. This is probably the most important piece of understanding when it comes to de-escalation, that anger is something that we refer to as a bodyguard emotion, meaning that anger protects people from feeling other things, which are usually much more uncomfortable. What I mean by that is that anger is an externalized emotion. So I can be mad at you and mad at them and mad at the situation and getting it out. And that's much, as crazy as it might sound, it's easier to do that than to sit with an internalized emotion like sadness or grief or fear. Those three particularly are really uncomfortable for people, humans. They're deeper. They tend to be more internalized, and we're not as comfortable with them at all. So a lot of what ends up happening with the expression of anger is that we channel these feelings of sadness and grief and fear into an external expression of distress or aggression. It's really common to do that. Another phrase, I think this is a C.S. Lewis quote, but I have to find the origin of it. A quote that I like is that I sat with my anger long enough until she told me her real name was grief. And I think that's a big deal, especially for kids. They might not have the words and the vocabulary to describe loss that they have experienced over the last couple of years. Man, I'm working with some sophomores in college right now. They had no prom, they had no senior year, they had none of these big markers, and there's grief there that they might not even have the language to identify. They just are struggling. And I know they're not alone, for sure. So using active listening at this point, I mean, we could tell you story after story, but a 5'2" charge nurse in a hospital coming to de-escalate a 6'4" parent who's storming through the halls, very upset, right? And it doesn't, physical size has nothing to do with our ability to de-escalate. It's all about our willingness to connect. It's about our willingness to listen to someone else's experience and try and understand it. Because if you can figure out what's happening underneath the anger, you can de-escalate pretty effectively. And then the last part of the model is engagement, and that is engaging resources or support for the angry person, whether that's EAP or HR or professional resources for them if that's needed, or and even more importantly, maybe engaging support for yourself, which is to say, if you have a confrontation with a student or a colleague or is it from C.S. Lewis? Okay, good. Thanks, Debbie. I thought it was. I just need to give him credit. If you have a confrontation with someone, don't go home and try and sleep on it, right? Process it. Talk to somebody. Don't pretend it didn't happen, because your brain will remember that it happened whether you want to or not, right? Your body will internalize that, and that's when it shows up as a migraine or a stomach problem or something a couple weeks or days or months down the line. So please engage appropriate support. Don't just shrug it off and pretend it didn't happen. At least be able to relate it. Try to talk it through with a colleague. Man, I had this encounter. It really shook me up. Would you be willing to listen? I just need to kind of replay it in my head a little bit. Yeah. Okay. Is this me or you, Tona? Is this still me?
Go to the next slide and I'll be able to tell you.
You know what happened? I printed out all of our slides and they're sitting right over there across the room on my printer. So great.
I think this is still you.
Okay. So when we talk about actionable resilience, I mean, I don't know if many of you have heard either one of us speak before, but Tona and I are very grounded in pragmatic approaches, right? Resilience has become a word that we talk about a lot, but we don't want it to be theoretical. We want it to be an actionable concept that people can take home and do something with. So this is about identifying ways to enhance connection, enhance that sense of purpose. These 4 ingredients of resilience: connection, adaptability, purpose, and hope. You have to keep in mind where you feel like you are empowered to take action and to improve things. And if you don't take care of yourselves as people who are, I mean, I would say not arguably critical to the support of youth, then we all lose more advocacy. We all lose more support. And these kids need all the people that they can get on their side right now. So if we don't take care of ourselves as supporters, it's a resource that is not, it's misspent, right? We have to do this. These are those 4 ingredients again. And we have 2 more slides, or at least 1 more slide on the next one that breaks it down even further. But I use this metaphor of a tree because it helps sort of coalesce these ingredients. Otherwise, they seem maybe a little bit abstract. But the purpose is the fruit of the tree. The connection are the roots of the tree. That's what grounds you and supports you. That's your people, right? Your network. Adaptability is the trunk of the tree that sways in the storm. And hope is like moss that grows on the north side of the tree, where it's dark and cold, right? Moss thrives on the north side of the tree, where the resources are scarce. And hope also thrives in adversity, but it's usually not what we're paying attention to. Usually we're too busy trying to solve problems to recognize the true opportunities that might exist in some chaos sometimes. So this is that pragmatic breakdown of how each of these 4 things can be sought out a little bit or potentially developed. Purpose is about meaningful goals. So not just goals on a list, right? And not just existential meaning, but the combination of the 2. It's a meaningful direction to go. It's the kind of thing that coalesces for you why it is you're doing what you're doing and why it's meaningful to you and how are you going to go about doing it. So that could be work related, that could be out of work, like personal life related. There's no wrong way to go. It has to matter to you. And reminding yourself and being willing to re-examine what is my sense of purpose right now as I'm moving forward here is really going to be helpful for this resilience building. Connection is anything that prevents you from being isolated. It can be the family member, the friend, the child, the faith community, the sports friends, the hobbies, the social group. There's no wrong way to stay connected, but I will say this about connection. It's more important for us to foster and maintain healthy connections than it is to just keep the connections in our lives with people that are unhealthy. And a lot of what's happened over the last 3 years, especially with the isolation that many people have experienced, we may be in some part afraid to let go of any connections that we do have, when in fact, it really is about quality instead of quantity. It really is about good people who are healthy for us in our connection circle, rather than just people for their own sake. So evaluating that a little bit. And then adaptability. I don't know if Tona agrees with this, but in my experience, adaptability is the one that people struggle with the most. We just don't like change. And when I say we, I mean as a species, human beings don't like to change. We like to know what's going to happen. We like to be able to predict what's next. And there's nothing like a good crisis that prevents us from doing that. We need to be able to adjust and be creative and, try to keep doing the things that we know are working, but there's nothing like a good crisis that lets us have the opportunity, I'm going to reframe it, to shake it up and do it a different way, especially in education. Because to be frank, we all are aware of a lot of systems that have been in use for a long time that are not particularly effective. And it's like, okay, well, we know they don't work. Now's the chance to get rid of some stuff, do it differently, to foster certain other things, emphasize this, pay less attention to this over here and do it on purpose, not just haphazardly, but be a little bit more intentional. I think I truly believe that it is an opportunity. And that brings me to hope. Hope is not optimism. Hope is based on realistic opportunity for new things, new connections, new relationships, new ways of doing things. Hope is tricky because on an individual level, it is tempered by culture and lived experience. What I mean there is that for some kiddos, right, based on what they've seen and lived through in their lives, they may perceive accurately sometimes that they have less opportunity than the kiddo next to them for whatever reason. And hope is an extension of that sense of realistic opportunity. So some kids are going to have an innate sense of hope that's a little stronger than others, whose lived experience might say, you don't get to do those things. We need to work on that, right? But the reason why I'm mentioning it, and I think it's so important to keep in mind, is that it doesn't look the same across kids, across people. Hope is the only one of these four that really has a lot of cultural influence. And there's a reason why it is such a powerful message. It is such a powerful message across time, right, throughout history. But it is based on realistic opportunity and the potential development of those. Okay, so ways to break down resilience exploration. This could be in classroom or outside. We do it in two buckets: internal strengths and external resources. This, depending on what the purpose of the exercise is and your relationship with whomever you're speaking with, you can do this very literally on paper, write it down. What are your internal strengths and what are your external resources? Let's get really concrete. This could be just discussions by having kids do some free writing, recognizing and acknowledging and honoring strengths that they have or that they see in others. And then those external things, you can talk about names of people, sources of support, who's there for you, and what resources do you still need. When we go through crisis, we tend to get discombobulated is the first word that comes to mind, but that's not very clinical. We tend to get really mixed up about what we really have going and what we don't. We lose sight of the resources. We forget about the people who are on our side and the strengths that we have because we're so overwhelmed by the crisis that takes our attention. So doing this kind of concretely is helpful. And I think this is my last slide before I turn it back over to Tona. We get asked a lot about active coping, and I just want to be clear with what some of these things are. Active coping skills are things that are intentional behaviors that are designed to increase your sense of wellness or health, right? It's not an intentional behavior that lets you check out, which is avoidance or disassociation, playing video games. Not that there's anything wrong with those, right? But in small chunks, or surfing the internet or whatever it may be. So active coping is really being intentional about use of your time and your attention in a way that's oriented towards wellness. For anxiety, we recommend sensory things, anything sight, touch, taste, smell, and sound. If you engage the senses, it tends to ground you in the here and now, in the present moment. It reconnects your brain back with right now you're okay, not whatever happened earlier today that you can't stop thinking about or what's coming up tomorrow that you're worried about. It orients you to the present. And then one of our colleagues has long recommended, and I've recommended it ever since, keeping a frozen orange in the nurse's office, in the front office, or a bag of frozen oranges. They're wonderful for kids that are having anxiety or panic attacks. You take a frozen orange and you pick at it and peel it. And if you manipulate a really cold object, it's a sort of a neurological reset. Your fingertips have a ton of nerve endings and it directs all your attention to that thing. And it gets you totally out of the anxiety loop. Likewise with ice, you can put your hands in a bowl full of ice water or a Ziploc bag full of ice water for about 20 seconds, both hands. That will pretty much stop a panic attack. It's incredibly effective. My two favorite apps right now are Calm and Headspace. I've gone back and forth. They both have different things that I like about them, and there are free as well as paid versions for each one. But I like those too. And then I talked about sleep hygiene already. You're just being aware of, not engaging in revenge bedtime procrastination, trying to regulate bedtime, being mindful about caffeine intake and alcohol and sugar, not picking up your phone if your brain wakes you up at 2 o'clock in the morning, right? Don't further stimulate things, but keep a pad of paper by the side of your bed for that purpose so that you can write down what it is to get it out of your head, but not get a device. And then for depression, get a coping plan, create a personal coping plan where you write down things that you know work for you to help you feel better, to reduce symptoms, things that take 5 minutes, 10 minutes, make a whole range of time frames. I've said many times before, if everything on your coping plan takes an hour to do, you're never going to use it. So the things on your coping plan should have a range of times that you can use. They should also be varied, petting the dog, walking the dog, something you can do at work, like a list of things for at work versus at home, etc. And just small steps in the direction you want to go. Okay, Tona.
Well, we're bearing down on the last little bit of this. I'm going to suggest that everybody take a big breath and do a little bit of a stretch, because one of the things we know again from the research is an hour of information is a little harder to process unless we take a minute to kind of reset our bodies. So I want to highlight what has been going on for kids in particular. You guys are in the middle of that. You live that on a day-to-day basis, most of you, but the impact of this pandemic on not just adults, but on kids, I fully believe that some of the core of the distress that we're seeing is because we were so isolated for, justifiable reasons and concerns about infection and all, but socialization and social connection in person is such a core human need that to be without that for the periods of time that we were without that, I think was exceedingly damaging to all of us, and particularly damaging to kids, small kids. It's essential to our brains that we have this human connection, one with the other. And we have to recover from that. And kids in particular have to recover from that. Next slide, Kira, thanks. So I feel like I'm preaching to the choir, but there were groups within this pandemic that were disproportionately impacted by the disease itself, by the non-pharmaceutical interventions that were along with those diseases. So people of color, communities of color, certain ethnic groups, folks with very low socioeconomic status, sexual populations that are marginalized, the LGBTQ population, and kids. And kids have really been hit, and hard enough that governmental organizations and professional organizations that normally move at the speed of government stepped in reasonably fast for them and said, this is a crisis. We have to do something about this. So the Secretary of Health, the American Academy of Pediatrics, the American Psychological Association, group after group after group, kind of waving the flag and blowing the alarm about what has happened to kids over the last couple of years. Next slide, please. So you guys have probably all seen this. There was a lot of hoopla in the press about it, but the decrease in academic scores, which is possibly related to not having the sort of school experience that most kids were used to, that would be sort of normative for us, and possibly due to the psychological impact of the pandemic, so that kids are just having a harder time learning. Their brains are not reset yet to a place where they are feeling safe and calm and able to take in new information. So, but this is not a good trend, obviously. Next slide. And then I want to talk about the little ones, the ones who were born or early in their development when the pandemic was happening. And now we're seeing literature coming out about the developmental impacts of the pandemic, and particularly the social isolation around that. So little ones with verbal delays, motor delays, social delays, the kids who could not go to preschool, whose parents were depressed and anxious and weren't talking to them very much. Kids who couldn't have that sort of outside social activity, that moving around kind of stuff. I mean, for a while, the parks were closed. Even the trails were closed. So anyway, all of this impacting little ones in particular. And so we need to help these guys recover from what they've been through, help them to catch up. Next slide. So what kids need when they go through something like this is three things, basically. Trust. They need that to know that when you give them an answer, it's an honest answer, that you're not trying to trick them out of good intentions. I don't want to tell them the truth about this because they're young and it might be hard for them to hear. Better that they hear in a developmentally appropriate way an honest answer than a dishonest answer that they later come to understand was not true. That just erodes that trust connection with any little kids. They need safety, routine, and stability. And this is the first thing in a big disaster where the infrastructure is all destroyed like an earthquake. The very first thing the Red Cross does once it sets up its tents and people move into it is try to establish for children a space where they can have some quiet and a routine, getting back into meal times and bedtimes and those kind of time markers for when their whole world has been just crazily upset. And then some sense of control and a sense of future. And this is where, and Kira mentioned this is where we're certainly seeing our teenagers struggle a little bit with, why should I bother to go on to college? I just don't see how, I'm going to move through my life with all that's happened to me over the last 3 years, the things that I didn't get to do that that was just sort of what we did in our neighborhood, in our school, in our culture. So again, that sort of recovery needs to happen for kids at all ages. These are kind of pivot points that adults can work around and use to help kids develop that sense of, okay, I know kind of what my day is going to be like. I know what school is going to be like. The people that I talk to, the grownups that I speak to are being straight with me, even though sometimes it's not what I want to hear. And I think I might be able to move forward. Next slide, please. So not to be too gloomy and doomy, kids are remarkably resilient and their brains are remarkably resilient. And so we have to do our best to help them recover. How do we do that? Lots of physical activity. It resets our neurology when we get outside in nature. It's calming. It allows our brains to connect better. It distracts us from internal distress. So getting kids out and moving as much as they possibly can. Reading is hard right now. Reading is hard even for adults right now because we don't have the attention span that maybe we used to. But reading for pleasure, whatever you can get kids to read, that will help again to engage them in that other whole world out there that's in the world of books and other information outside of, kind of their day-to-day lives. Social connection, again, you can't stress that enough. These social connections, and that sometimes with younger kids in particular, it requires parents to do some of the navigating, negotiating, planning with the other parent, all those kinds of things. And, there's a good comment here in the chat. I see that, we're asking all of us to do these things when we've all been through this too. Parents are also traumatized, particularly parents of marginalized communities or communities that have been the victims of, bias and racism and, other sorts of negative, malignant impacts on their lives. And then having a pandemic on top of it, now we're asking them to step up and pitch in even more. And this is where that social connection among adults can help us to do that. If we can support each other, we have a little more energy to do the work that's going to be so important for kids in their recovery too. We want to model self-care and boundaries. And again, we're not very good at that. A lot of us as adults, and particularly if you're in a position where you're a helper, an educator, a counselor, social worker, nurse, mom, dad, those roles push us, and because we want to do the best thing that we can do. And so having those boundaries and having our kids look to see that we're saying, no, I'm not going to do that tonight because I want to hang out with my kids, or I'm going to put this work aside. I'm moving my laptop out of this room because I want to have the evening without that. Those sort of boundary models are really helpful for kids as they begin to develop those for themselves. I mentioned before in the communication part about this, sort of when your kids are willing to talk, wherever that is, and it's often, at weird times, being really intentional about that focus and attention on them when they're trying to tell you something. And then monitoring and reducing screen time. Again, easy to say and really hard to do. I see kids on their phone all the time, and they're unfortunately the victims of software and algorithms that create almost an addictive quality to screen time. First of all, it's distracting. That's why adults are doing, what is it, revenge bedtime deferral or whatever. But kids are doing it because the games and the apps that they're using create a situation where they're looking for the next hit of dopamine. I mean, they're designed by neuropsychological experts looking for how can we keep these kids engaged. So when I say, reducing screen time or monitoring screen time, I realize that that's an uphill battle. It's like cutting down on smoking or anything else that's really, really engages and sort of pulls us in. I almost clicked my screen to move the slide. Next slide, please, Kira. So the educational part is hard as well. We talk about kids' brains are having a hard time readapting to education, to the academic part of school. And so what we're seeing and what we're hearing across the state, actually, we're hearing it across the nation. Kira and I were in a meeting not long ago, and we're hearing the same things that we're hearing here in Washington State. Kids really struggling with attention and focus, really edgy, active, unable to kind of settle in the classroom, or, putting their heads down and sleeping, or putting their hoods up with their ear pods in, just sort of shutting down, shutting away from the school. And then we're hearing about a tremendous amount of irritability and aggression. Kids aggressive with each other, kids aggressive with school staff and teachers, just this angry sort of mix in the school setting. So it takes its toll on the adults who are trying to do the best that they can for these kids. Certainly it's taking its toll on kids in terms of academics. But I think this is another area where we have to kind of turn our focus not only towards helping kids learn, but helping kids move into that more calm, more centered place. Next slide, please. So really, in this particular place where we are encouraging a trauma-informed perspective. Again, that gets back to how you think about things in some ways really impacts the way that you feel about them. And so when you have a child who is acting out in big disrespectful ways, or so shut down that they're essentially ignoring you when you're trying to do the best that you can for them, thinking about that as an outcome of trauma, not as necessarily just a behavior in and of itself. This is a disrespectful kid, or that kid is just, rude because I'm trying to talk about something and they've just shut me down. Really sort of pulling back, kind of like you do with any sort of behavior, and looking at What is it that might be leading to this behavior? How can we re-engage, recognizing that kids have gone through a ridiculous amount of trauma, and get them to learn how to manage themselves, learn all those social emotional skills that are important in any sort of educational environment, so that then they can learn material. The curriculum can help. So with older kids, I would say kids 3rd grade and up, psychoeducation is good for them. This is what happens to kids when they go through a disaster. I wonder if any of you have experienced this. These are the kinds of things that are really common across the whole world with kids who've had a bad event, or, the last couple of years. That kind of psychoeducation is calming for adults. It increases the resilience of adults, and it has the capacity to do that for kids too. It sort of includes them in the all of us part of it. Here's what's happened to all of us. What have you noticed about yourself? And then setting their own goals. Kids and adults right now, the default is often, you are not the boss of me. But engaging them in being part of that goal setting helps them to diffuse that a little bit, not do so much of this, but kind of working together. What do you want to have happen here in this particular situation, in your classroom, in this project that you're working on? Next slide, please. So again, this is psychoeducation for kids, but helping them understand that a little bit of stress is good. We need that. A little bit of stress helps with performance. What we don't want is not enough or too much. This is sort of the educational piece of it. And then coaching them on recognizing when they're ready to engage. These are kind of not atypical kind of classroom skills for most educators, but we have to ramp it up with the kids right now, because they have been, I hate to use the word damage, but they have been severely impacted by all that they have lived through. So those small steps, small focus areas, recognizing when they're successful. We talk about this in organizations, bosses and supervisors recognizing small wins. Same thing with kids. You may not have gotten an A, but you got 10 questions right this time, more than the last time we went through this. So those little things. And then helping them write things down, or, sometimes you can be the scribe, or a parent can be the scribe. Things that they think they have done, the goals that they think they can achieve. What's been successful? What do they need to do outside of that? Because just like us, they're not having an easy time remembering anything. Next slide, please. The other thing we're seeing, because the kids aren't in such a bad place, is the impact on school staff. And so again, preaching to the choir, but over the last 3 years, teachers have had to switch their whole curriculum to online, then switch it back, or hybrid, or then the kids came back to school and everybody was hoping, oh, this'll do it, everything's going to be reset. But it just created additional difficulties and challenges for everyone in the educational environment. So all of those things have taken their toll. Teachers are, by the numbers, burning out and quitting in many districts across the country, probably across the world. I don't have data on Europe and Asia, but I can certainly speak to the data in the United States. And it is because teachers have been through 3 years of very difficult circumstances. And now they have kids coming back into their classroom who are not the kids that they were when they left the educational environment, or before they went through the pandemic. So just managing work role, maybe your own kids have struggled and you're managing them as well. All of these things kind of combine to create this big ball of challenges that we have to kind of pick apart and begin to solve, a little bit at a time, and begin to process and talk about what all this has been like for us. Next slide, please. these are just kind of grandma wisdom in terms of protective factors for kids and for adults. If you can find things funny, it goes a long way. If you can adapt and think outside the box, that helps. It's part, one of those resilience factors. Physical exercise, we know works. People who have a religious life or a spiritual life this is the research, physically healthier and mentally healthier. Good problem solving skills, good social skills, that keeps those connections together. Now, we don't all have all of these things. Some of us don't have very many of them, but these are the things that if we can identify and encourage, these are the things that help us continue to be resilient and move through and adapt to all of the changes that are going on right now. Next slide, please. Family protective factors are key. And as many of you know, a lot of families don't have these factors. Parents who are struggling with each other, parents who are struggling with their lives, with health conditions, with the financial aspects of the last few years, who may themselves be the product of many adverse childhood events in their own lives, may have a history of trauma. And then their children are coming into the school setting with not enough of a foundation to lift them up so that they can, again, move past some of the challenges that we've been living through and that kids in particular have been living through. So encouraging whenever you can in practical ways in your own family and in the families of the kids that you serve, that positive family environment, helping parents to connect and talk with their kids, just encourage them to do those things that we know that help: stability, routine, getting to bed on time, getting up on time. Those are relatively simple things, but they are really hard for some parents who are just overwhelmed and struggling on their own. So whatever you can do within your role to support those folks, that will go towards supporting the kids as well. Next slide, please. So when we are intervening, and I know we're getting close to the time, there are certain things that are good for psychological support after a disaster. First things first, food safety, reconnection with people that have been separated. And then psychological first aid is a very simple, not an intervention, but a very simple approach to just sort of very, very basic psychological skills at the bottom level. So it's, is anybody in an emergency? And then it's, what have you experienced? What do you need right now? Active listening, active listening. Next slide, please. This is a particular one, and it'll be on the slide deck. You can look into this. Listen, Protect, Connect is, I think, a particularly good psychological first aid tool. Next slide, please. And next slide, please. So the idea when kids are really needing something else is a continuum of care. So we start at the bottom, with it's all kids getting some sort of psychological first aid if they've been through a disaster. And from that, we move on to the intervention intensity. So this is a model called triage to care. And we talk about, screening kids, triaging kids for trauma impact, trauma exposure and symptoms, and then putting them in the right sort of care for what they need. Next slide, please. This is what's called a stepped care approach. This is a project that we have going on in Washington State. There's a large project going on in Sonoma County in California, and it's triage for trauma, because not all kids who are traumatized and have PTSD have symptoms. Sometimes they're numb and shut down. So we want to know what happened to them. And then we want to know if they have any symptoms. And in this project, they get assigned a graduate student, and they get what's called the first 4 modules of trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy. And then they get screened again. And what we have found is that with 4 modules with the parents, it's psychoeducation, trauma education, learning affective regulation, and learning how to think about things a little bit differently. Nearly half of the children improve to the level that they're subclinical. If they don't improve, they get stepped up to the remaining sessions, and then they're discharged from care. It's a really efficient way of getting the right kind of services, the right amount of services to the right kids. Next slide. And it models the MTSS model, which is all kids get a certain amount of this. Some kids need more, and some kids are in crisis and they need even more. So it's the same sort of pyramid. We start with, the basics, and we move up to when kids need additional actual services for what's gone on with them. Next slide, please. These are the key takeaways. It really comes down to take a breath and pause. Thinking about moving through long distance, not I have to be perfect at all times. I have to do everything right. I have to do it right now. But really sort of managing yourself, your schedule, your energy for the long haul. What's helped you before? How do you get outside? We have a ton of research on why that helps. How are you going to do that? Remembering that resilience is not a badge to be won, but a process that we can learn and practice. So all these little nuggets, I think, are the ones that we would like you to go away from this with.
Thank you so much for joining us today. I know 90 minutes was long, but it felt like a treat. Thank you, Kira and Tona, and see you all at the next one.
Thanks, everyone.